Okay, this is lecture number 2 of the Cold War era, 1950s and 60s. And this is Social Studies 10, and I'm Mr. Banks. Last time we talked about some of the origins of the Cold War, and we'll go into more of that and the espionage and life at home in North America. So, as we know, the Cold War was getting more severe during this time, and the tensions were rising. Both sides had developed atomic weaponry, and by this period, both the Soviets and the West, the Americans, had produced something called a hydrogen bomb, which was something like 50 times more powerful than the bombs used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You see on the right here, this is Life magazine from 1962, and it says, "New facts you must know about fallout." And fallout was the poisonous material that would go into the air, the nuclear radiation that would happen after a nuclear attack. So many towns and cities developed plans, civil defense plans, to deal with nuclear attacks. And they developed these huge shelters. Some people had them even in their backyards. And so you can imagine a lot of fear and paranoia. World War II was only, 10, 15 years earlier. And another war with the Soviets seemed very possible. So there was a lot of anti-communism in this period under President Truman and then President Eisenhower. In Canada, we're looking at the time where we had Louis Saint Laurent as Prime Minister after Mackenzie King, and then he's followed up by a conservative Prime Minister named John Diefenbaker, and we'll learn about them. And then again, after Diefenbaker, we have Lester B. Pearson, who's another liberal. Now, the Americans were very concerned with nuclear attacks, and this bled over to Canada as well. So in schools, like today we have earthquake drills, fire drills, intruder drills. During the 50s and 60s, they had duck and cover drills where they tried to protect themselves, students in schools, from a nuclear attack. And so the advice was to duck and cover, which really won't help you during a nuclear attack. But they had to tell the kids something to make them a little less afraid and to give them something to do. Now, the United States was concerned about something called the missile gap at the time, which was a perceived shortfall in nuclear weapons. They believed that the Soviets had a superior nuclear capability than they did. And the Soviets launch a man into space. They put the first man into space with the Sputnik test in 1957. And they also developed intercontinental ballistic missiles in the same year. And those are called, for short, ICBMs. In fact, what the Americans didn't realize was that the missile gap was actually in their favor, that they actually had quite a bit more nuclear weapons than the Soviets did. But this gave a huge rise to armaments industries, to increase nuclear capacity, and what Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. So when Eisenhower went out of power in 1960, he was being replaced by President Kennedy, but in his last speech he said, "We have to warn against influence sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex." And what he meant was he was concerned that moving forward in history, the United States was going to be more and more influenced by the weapons industries, and their economy was going to become too dependent on those industries, and that was going to change their politics. And he definitely turned out to be right about that. It's very difficult to stop Americans making weapons and guns and all these things because it's a big part of their economy. And it does influence a lot of their decisions. So Eisenhower was very prescient, or he could kind of see the future. And I'll post that speech for you uh, with this lecture. Okay, moving forward. Okay, here we see products of the nuclear age. So on the bottom right, we see a bunch of kids, elementary school age kids, ducking and covering in a nuclear drill, as if that was going to help them. Right next to that, we see Godzilla. Godzilla is a product of this age too. And what is Godzilla? He's a little lizard who was mutated by nuclear radiation to become this huge monster and destroy cities. So Godzilla is a Japanese invention, and you can kind of imagine why the Japanese would create this kind of monster that could come in and destroy cities after they've been the victims of the first nuclear attack. There was atomic motifs or imagery used to sell products, like on the top left there. And we also had a changing role of women, a very consumer-oriented society, and the role marketed towards women was one of going back into the home, going back to traditional roles of homemaking and motherhood, and these modern conveniences like this new 1950s kitchen set that would make life even easier for women. So it's not until the 1960s that the role of women really starts to become questioned in North American society, and we'll get to that later. Moving forward. Traders within. So one of the early events in the Cold War is the defection of a clerk working in the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. And we'll talk about that, but that reveals that there are communists within the governments in the United States and Canada. And so this causes a lot of suspicion, especially considering that the nuclear plans had been stolen by the Soviets from the Americans. But we'll get into the defection of a guy named Igor Guzenko. First, let's talk about McCarthyism. So McCarthyism is basically a communist witch hunt that occurs mostly in the United States. Canada doesn't fall down this rabbit hole in the same way. Canada does have does search for communists within their government, for spies, and many people get fired in Canada, but there isn't the same movement to arrest and destroy people's lives that exists in the United States. So the United States government wants Canada to go further, and what the U.S. is doing is they have something called the House Un-American Activities Commission. And this is headed by a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. You can see him on the top right, and underneath him is a piece of propaganda saying, "Is this tomorrow, America under communism?" So people from all walks of life in the United States have their lives ruined. People who maybe have are friends with a multiracial group of people that are maybe maybe homosexual or have sexual differences in some way. These people are blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Commission. And just remember that in the 1930s, during the Depression, there was an American Communist Party and Canadian Communist Party, and they did have some contact with the Soviets. So if you had even attended a meeting of one of those communist parties in the 30s, the FBI would have investigated you and tried to find out what was your role. The FBI was headed by a guy who's pretty shady, who did a lot of shady things. His name was J. Edgar Hoover, and he was a rabid anti-communist. Another guy that made his name trying to find communists in this McCarthyist era was a kind of Richard Nixon, who would later become president. And him and McCarthy, they were accusing the Democratic Party under Roosevelt and under Truman of being soft on communism. And part of this had to do with the loss of China to the communists in the late 1940s. So they had these hearings in front of the television cameras, and McCarthy would question people, especially people from Hollywood, whether they were communists or not. He would say, are you now or ever have been a member of the Communist Party? And people would deny it, but just the mere accusation of it would be enough to ruin people's lives. Many people were not allowed to work in Hollywood or in other industries. Again, they were blacklisted. Other people committed suicide. So McCarthy ruined thousands of people's lives, and this was a really terrible thing in American history. But eventually, he was found out to be kind of a fraud, and a couple of years later, he died of alcoholism. So the overall effect of McCarthyism was that any idea in American politics that was kind of left-wing was now seen as communist, and that continues until today. People like Bernie Sanders are still considered, they're called communists by everyone. Canadian politics tend to be to the left of American politics, and they would probably think that our NDP party is kind of communist. So it changed American politics from then until now. It's had kind of a huge impact to McCarthyism. I'm going to post a TED Talk video on McCarthyism. It's only 5 minutes long, and it's kind of in a cartoon format, so you should enjoy that. International intrigue. One thing I didn't mention on the last slide is I would like you to read page 192 and 193, and the section is called "Was the Red Menace Real?" And I'd like you to answer the 5 questions on page 193 and put them on the page, okay, in the comments for this video. So try to answer one question, and everyone in the class should be answering these questions. Even if they've already been answered, just show me that you're actually paying attention, clicking the like button. Not enough of you are doing this right now. It's kind of disappointing. Okay, I want to see more engagement. Okay, international intrigue. So this is on page 190 and 191 in your textbook. And I mentioned this earlier, but right at the end of World War II, there is a man working in the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. And remember that the Soviets and Canadians were allies during World War II. And this man's name is Igor Guzenko. Now, he finds that life in Canada is far better than life in the Soviet Union. And he doesn't want to leave Canada. So he decides to defect from the Soviet Union to Canada. And he brings all these documents with him, Igor Guzenko. And the documents expose the fact that Stalin and the Soviet Union have been spying on the United States and Canada this whole time, and they've been attempting to steal the nuclear secrets, which they eventually do. Now, Guzenko defects, and he has to be put into protective custody by the Canadian government. So for the rest of the time he appeared in public, you can see a picture of this in your textbook. He had to wear a bag over his head, so people didn't know who he was, because he was worried about being assassinated. And Joseph Stalin had a reputation of assassinating anybody who crossed him, including a lot of members of his own party, very famous people like Leon Trotsky that he had killed. But this causes a huge stir within the Allies, within the British, Canadians, and Americans. And it creates a situation where there's a lot of tension. And so some historians think this is the kind of official beginning of the Cold War. Um, in the United States, this leads to a lot of arrests and the execution, ultimately, of a couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were tried and executed for treason. In Canada, it leads to 39 arrests and 18 convictions for communist spies. So there are communists within the government, but as McCarthy and other people exaggerated the extent of how bad it was. Which incident first made Canadians realize Canada was involved in the Cold War? So what do we think? The acceptance of nuclear warheads from the United States? That comes much later, and we haven't talked about that, so that's not the right answer. The installation of radar bases across northern Canada? No, that happened later as well. We're talking about something that happened in the beginning of the Cold War, so right after World War II. The deployment of combat troops in Southeast Asia. So Canada never really deployed combat troops in Vietnam, so we can cross that one out. So the answer is the detection of aspiring operating in Canada. And that's the one that Igor Guzenko was part of. Next question. Why was Canada viewed as a middle power after World War II? It was a member of the Commonwealth. Well, that happened before, so that didn't make Canada any more powerful or anything. So when we talk about a middle power, we're talking about Canada not being one of the superpowers like the Soviets, the Americans, or maybe the British and French, but being somewhere in the middle. Its nuclear weapon program was developing. Well, no, Canada didn't really have a nuclear weapon program. Its economy was based on primary resources. Well, that's somewhat true, but I don't know what that has to do with a middle power. It was becoming influential in international affairs. Yes, that's the best answer. The two ideologies that were in conflict during the Cold War, anarchy and socialism. Well, no, neither side was anarchic, and socialism isn't strong enough to describe the Soviet Union. Democracy and fascism. Well, no, fascism was out of vogue. Democracy was good, though. That's the West as democratic. Communism and democracy. Well, that seems like a pretty good answer to me. Communism and totalitarianism. Well, no, communists at the time were totalitarian. So the answer is C, communism and democracy. The next one. Most Canadians favor American shows. The Massey Commission. Remember, we learned about that in Lecture 1. How did the Canadian government respond to the Commission's findings? Well, we're talking about television shows. So, A is about film. We can cross that one off. D is about radio. We can cross that one off. And I think the best answer would be B. The CBC became the national television station. So give yourself a round of applause if you got those three correct. Here are the answers. Okay, moving forward. This is a picture of the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito, and an American general, Douglas MacArthur. This picture shocked Japanese. It shocked Japan because to see a Westerner side by side with the Emperor, there's a pretty clear message here that MacArthur, being the taller man, is kind of equal to the Emperor here. And the Americans basically were in control of Japan after the war. So MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur here, he's actually more powerful at this time than the Emperor. So MacArthur had this picture taken intentionally to kind of show Japan, like what's happening. And MacArthur's also put in charge of the war effort that's happening in Korea. So we'll talk about that now. So the Korean War lasts about 3 years, from 1950 to 1953. It's often called the Forgotten War. Culturally, it hasn't had as big an impact on our society as like World War II or even the Vietnam War. You can think about what are the cultural things left over from the Korean War. Well, in North America, we had this sitcom and movie called MASH, and that's about it. There hasn't really been much chatter over the Korean War. Now, Korea had been a Japanese colony since 1910. And after the Japanese surrender, the North was occupied by the Soviets and the South by the Americans. So they set up North and South Korea. Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current supreme leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, he takes over control of the North, and Syngman Rhee the South. And the South had a fairly repressive government, but the Americans wanted to put in a democracy there and at least have a government that was friendly to them. Now, President Truman had been criticized for the loss of China and also for the United States becoming a permanent war economy, for continuing this proliferation of weapons and arms. So the United States, they want to show that they're not being bullies here, and they want to try to take all of Korea in a police action. Now, this is part of the containment/domino theory. The domino theory was a idea in American foreign policy that if one region fell to communism, the whole region would. And also containment, which said that if we don't stop the spread of communism, if we don't contain it, it will spread like fire. So those are what those two terms mean. And they're used in the Vietnam War as well. Now, Douglas MacArthur, he is the highest ranking general in Asia, and so he's going to lead the Allied side. And Mackenzie King told Prime Minister, so Louis Saint Laurent is the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, and Mackenzie King, he's still alive at this point, and we remember how weird and wacky he was. He told Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent that Roosevelt's ghost had told him involvement in Korea would lead to World War III, so to stay out of Korea. But Prime Minister Saint Laurent kind of ignored that advice. Here is a propaganda poster from the North Koreans, and we can see on the bottom right how they view the Americans here. Here's another one, similar. The Americans are seen as the imperialists trying to take over North Korea, and the North Koreans want to take over the South, so they're inevitably going to come into conflict here. So this is Canada's role in the Korean War and the international stage. Canada, as I said, it was becoming a middle power, and it wants to build on its reputation that it started in World War I and II. So they send a moderate size of volunteer soldiers. Unfortunately, they're poorly equipped, poorly trained, and they are there to contribute to the United Nations force. So the Americans are calling this a police action. Now, the United Nations forces push the North Koreans back to the middle of the country, or the 38th, I believe it's the 38th parallel. And American bombers are destroying dams and doing a lot of damage to the north. Now, eventually, they push the Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River on the border of China. But that has a bad effect because that brings Chinese troops into the war as well. And as we know, China is very populated. There's a lot of troops to draw from. This is a map of the war. So it's a seesaw battle, and you can see how it goes back and forth, and then it settles on the current border. So nothing is really accomplished out of this war other than bad feelings and a lot of deaths. The Americans are also testing nuclear weapons here. It's kind of an intimidation, but nuclear weapons are not used in this conflict. So the Korean War is disastrous for everyone. And as I mentioned earlier, Douglas MacArthur, he makes some really big mistakes, and eventually he's fired by Truman. And he pulls China into the war and also threatens the use of nuclear arms. Canadian forces are disorganized like they'd been in Hong Kong before the Japanese attacked. So it's seen as a United Nations-backed war, but it kind of showed that the United Nations and the Soviets were boycotting the United Nations at the time. But it showed that the United Nations and NATO were kind of like puppets of the United States. And they weren't necessarily going to be used for promoting world peace. Canada also learns a lesson that they shouldn't just involve themselves in any war that the United States does. And this is going to become really important when we get to Vietnam and even like later in history, the war in Iraq in 2003. So both Vietnam and Iraq, Canada refused to participate because they didn't see those wars as being productive and having clear goals. Here's some pictures from the Korean War. And there's huge casualties in this war, hundreds of thousands of people, and obviously the Koreans are the most of the casualties. Here are American/United Nations troops. And next class we're going to talk about the Suez Crisis, and we'll probably get all the way up to the 1960s and maybe even talk about President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. Okay, thanks for listening. Talk to you guys soon.